to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This episode brings to a close a year-long project to present the entirety of The King of Elfland's Daughter, with annotations suitable to Ars Magica and other role-playing games. Lord Dunsany has been a significant part of Games from Folktales since approximately its second year, so for about 4 years now, when I started harvesting his short works for monsters. His longest and best-known work, The King of Elfland's Daughter, only entered the public domain in 2020, and we've been following Michelle Fry's LibriVox recording, which she released into the public domain. I'm going to go onto the LibriVox site and thank Michelle, and if you've enjoyed these episodes, I suggest you do the same. In this episode, we see the Elf King do something from the magic of deep fairy, something that can't be done in Ars Magica without breaking the fiction that fairies have no great underlying goal beyond the sapping of human vitality. We see the old magic, the ancient magic. We see him drag a piece of the earth into Arcadia. In a way, we see a Regio form, and then the Regio split itself off from the mundane world, but within this there is a tiny bubble left of the divine aura. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with me.
Chapter 33, The Shining Line. Alveric wandered on, alone of that small company of 3, without a hope to guide him. For Niv and Zend, who were lately led by the hope of their fantastic quest, no longer yearned for Elfland, but were guided now by their plan to hold Alveric back from it. They vacillated more slowly than sane folk, but clung with far more than sane fervor to each vacillation. And Zend, that had wandered through so many years with the hope of Elfland before him, looked on it, now that he had seen its frontier, as one of the rivals of the moon. Niv, who had endured as much for Alveric's quest, saw in that magical land something more fabulous than was in all his dreams. And now, when Alveric attempted lame cajoleries with those swift and ferocious minds, he received no more answers from Zend than the curt statement, "It is not the will of the moon," while Niv would only reiterate, "Have I not dreams enough?" They were wandering back again past farms that had known them years before. With their old gray tent more tattered, they appeared in the twilight, adding a shade to the evening, in fields wherein they and their tent had become a legend. And never was Alveric unwatched by some mad eye, lest he should slip from the camp and come to Elfland, and be where dreams were stranger than Niv's, and under a power more magical than the moon. Often he tried, creeping silently from his place in the dead of night. One moonlight night he tried first, waiting awake till all the world seemed sleeping. He knew that the frontier was not far away as he crept from the tent into the brightness and black shadows, and past Niv sleeping heavily. A little way he went, and there was Zend sitting still on a rock, gazing into the face of the moon. Round came Zend's face, and, newly inspired by the moon, he shouted and leapt at Alveric. They had taken away his sword, and Niv woke and came towards them with immense fury, united to Zend by one jealousy, for each of them knew well that the wonders of Elfland were greater than any fancy that their minds would ever know. And again he tried, on a night when no moon shone, but on that night Niv was sitting outside the camp, relishing in a strange and joyless way a certain comradeship that there was between his ravings and the interstellar darkness. And there in the night he saw Alveric slipping away towards the land whose wonders far transcended all Niv's poor dreams, and all the fury the lesser can feel for the greater awoke at once in his mind, and creeping up behind him without any help from Zend, he smote Alveric insensible to the ground. And never did Alveric plan any escape after that, but that the busy thoughts of madness anticipated it. And so they came, watchers and watched, over the fields of men, and Alveric sought help of the folk of the farms, but the cunning of Niv knew too well the tricks of sanity, so that when the folk came running over their fields to that queer grey tent from which they heard Alveric's cries, they found Niv and Zend posed in a calm that they had much practised, while Alveric told of his thwarted quest of Elfland. Now by many men all quests are considered mad, as the cunning of Niv knew. Alveric found no help here. As they went back by the way by which they had marched for years, Niv led that band of 3, stepping ahead of Alveric, and Zend, with his lean face held high, made all the leaner by the long thin points to which he had trained his beard and his moustaches, and wearing Alveric's sword that stuck out long behind him and its hilt high in front. And he stepped and perked his head with a certain air that revealed to the rare travellers who saw him that this sparse and ragged figure esteemed itself the leader of a greater band than were visible. Indeed, if one had just seen him at the end of the evening, with the dusk and the mist of the fenlands close behind him, he might have believed that in the dusk and the mist was an army that followed this gay, worn, confident man. Had the army been there, Niv was sane. Had the world accepted that an army was there, even though only Alveric and Zend followed his curious steps, still he was sane. But the lonely fancy that had not fact to feed on, nor the fancy of any other for fellowship, was for its loneliness mad. Zend watched Alveric all the while as they marched behind Niv, for their mutual jealousy of the wonders of Elfland bound Niv and Zend together to work as with one wild whim. And now one morning Niv stretched himself up to the fullest possible height of his lean inches, and extended his right arm high, and addressed his army. "We are come near again to Earl," he said, "and we shall bring new fancies in place of outworn things and things that are stale, and its customs shall be henceforth the way of the moon." Now Niv cared nothing for the moon, but he had great cunning, and he knew that Zend would aid his new plan against Earl, if only for the sake of the moon. And Zend cheered till the echoes came back from a lonely hill, and Niv smiled to them like a leader confident of his hosts. And Alveric rose against them then, and struggled with Niv and Zend for the last time, and learned that age or wandering or loss of hope had left him unable to strive against the maniacal strength of these 2. And after that he went with them more meekly, with resignation, caring no longer what befell him, living only in memory, and only for days that had been, and in November evenings in this dim camp in the chill he saw, looking only backwards through the years, spring mornings shine again on the towers of Earl. In the light of these mornings he saw Orion again, playing again with old toys that the witch had made with a spell. He saw Lyrazel move once more through the gracious gardens, yet no light that memory is able to kindle was strong enough to illumine much that camp in those sombre evenings when the damp rose up from the ground and the chill swooped out of the air, and Niv and Zend, as darkness came stealing nearer, began to chatter in low eager voices schemes inspired by such whims as throve at dusk in the waste. Only when the sad day drifted wholly thence, and Alveric slept by flapping tatters that streamed from the tent in the night, then only was memory, unhindered by the busy changes of day, able to bring back Earl to him, bright, happy, and vernal, so that while his body lay still in far fields, in the dark and the winter, all that was most active and live in him was back over the wolds in Earl, back over the years in spring with Lyrazel and Orion. How far he was bodily, in sheer miles from his home, for which his happy thoughts each night forsook his weary frame, Alveric knew not. It was many years since their tent had stood one evening a grey shape in that landscape in which it now waved its tatters. But Niv knew that of late they had come nearer to Earl, for his dreams of it came to him now soon after he fell asleep, and they used to come to him further on in the night, on the other side of midnight, and even towards morning, and from this he argued that they used to have further to come, and were now but a little way off. When he told this secretly one evening to Zend, Zend listened gravely but gave no opinion, merely saying, "The moon knows." Nevertheless, he followed Niv, who led this curious caravan, always in that direction from which his dreams of the Valley of Earl came soonest. And this queer leadership brought them nearer to Earl, as often happens where men follow leaders that are crazy, or blind, or deceived. They reach some port or other, though they stray down the years with little foresight enough. Were it otherwise, what would become of us? And one day the upper parts of the towers of Earl looked at them out of blue distance, shining in early sunlight above a curve of the downs. And towards them Niv turned at once and led directly, for the line of their wandering march had not pointed straight to Earl, and marched on as a conqueror that sees some new city's gates. What his plans were, Alvaric did not know, but kept to his apathy. And Zend did not know, for Niv had merely said that his plans must be secret. Nor did Niv know, for his fancies poured through his brain and rushed away. What fancies made what plans in a mood that was yesterday's, how could he tell today? Then as they went, they soon came to a shepherd, standing amongst his grazing sheep, and leaning upon his crook, who watched and seemed to have no other care but only to watch all things going by, or when nothing passed, to gaze and gaze at the downs till all his memories were fashioned out of their huge grass curves. He stood, a bearded man, and watched them with never a word as they passed. And one of Niv's mad memories suddenly knew him, and Niv hailed him by his name, and the shepherd answered, and who should he be but Vand? Then they fell talking, and Niv spoke suavely, as he always did with sane folk, aping with clever mimicry the ways and the tricks of sanity, lest Alvaric should ask for help against him. But Alvaric sought no help. Silent he stood and heard the others talking, but his thoughts were far in the past, and their voices were only sounds to him. And Vand inquired of them if they had found Elfland, but he spoke as one asks of children if their toy boat has been to the Happy Isles. He had had for many years to do with sheep, and had come to know their needs and their price, and the need men have of them, and these things had risen imperceptibly up all around his imagination, and were at last a wall over which he saw no further. When he was young, yes, once, he had sought for Elfland, but now, why, now he was older, such things were for the young. "But we saw its border," said Zend, "the border of twilight." "A mist," said Vand, "of the evening." "I have stood," said Zend, "upon the edge of Elfland." But Vand smiled and shook his bearded head as he leaned on his long crook, and every wave of his beard, as he shook it slowly, denied Zend's tales of that border, and his lips smiled it away, and his tolerant eyes were grave with the lore of the fields we know. "No, not Elfland," he said. And Niv agreed with Vand, for he watched his mood, studying the ways of sanity, and they spoke of Elfland lightly, as one tells of some dream that came at dawn and went away before waking. And Alvaric heard with despair, for Lyrazel dwelt not only over the border, but even, as he saw now, beyond human belief, so that all at once she seemed remoter than ever, and he still lonelier. "I sought for it once," said Vand, "but no, there's no Elfland." "No," said Niv, and only Zend wondered. "No," replied Vand, and shook his head, and lifted his eyes to his sheep. And just beyond his sheep, and coming towards them, he saw a shining line. So long his eyes stayed fixed on that shining line, coming over the downs from the eastward, that the others turned and looked. They saw it too, a shimmering line of silver, or a little blue like steel, flickering and changing with the reflection of strange passing colors. And before it, very faint like threatening breezes breathing before a storm, came the soft sound of very old songs. It caught, as they all stood gazing, one of Van's furthest sheep, and instantly its fleece was that pure gold that is told of in old romance. And the shining line came on, and the sheep disappeared altogether. They saw now that it was about the height of the mist from a small stream, and still Van stood gazing at it, neither moving nor thinking. But Niv turned very soon, and beckoned curtly to Zend, and seized Elveric by the arm, and hastened away towards Earl. The gleaming line, that seemed to bump and stumble over every unevenness of the rough fields, came not so fast as they hastened, yet it never stopped when they rested, never wearied when they were tired, but came on over all the hills and hedges of earth, nor did sunset change its appearance or check its pace. Chapter 34. The Last Great Rune. As Elveric hastened back, led by two madmen, to those lands over which he had long ago been lord, the horns of Elfland had sounded in Earl all day, and though only Orion heard them, they no less thrilled the air, flooding it deep with their curious golden music, and filling the day with a wonder that others felt, so that many a young girl leaned from her window to see what was enchanting the morning. But as the day wore on, the enchantment of the unheard music dwindled, giving place to a feeling that weighed on all minds in Earl, and seemed to bode the imminence of some unknown region of wonder. All his life Orion had heard these horns blowing at evening, except upon days on which he had done ill. If he heard the horns at evening, he knew that it was well with him. But now they had blown in the morning, and blew all day, like a fanfare in front of a march, and Orion looked out of his window and saw nothing, and the horns rang on, proclaiming he knew not what. Far away they called his thoughts from the things of earth, that are the concerns of men, far away from all that casts shadows. He spoke to no man that day, but went among his trolls, and such elfin things as had followed them over the border. And all men that saw him perceived such a look in his eyes as showed his thoughts to be far in realms that they dreaded. And his thoughts were indeed far thence, once more with his mother. And hers were with him, lavishing tendernesses that the years had denied her, in their swift passage over our fields that she never had understood. And somehow he knew she was nearer. And all that strange morning the will-o'-the-wisps were restless, and the trolls leaped wildly all about their lofts, for the horns of Elfland tinged all the air with magic, and excited their blood, although they could not hear them. But towards evening they felt impending some great change, and all grew silent and moody. And something brought to them yearnings for their far magical home, as though a breeze had blown suddenly into their faces, straight off the tarns of Elfland. And they ran up and down the street, looking for something magical to ease their loneliness amongst mundane things, but found nothing resembling the spell-born lilies that grew in their glory above the elfin tarns. And the folk of the village perceived them everywhere, and longed for the wholesome earthly days again that there were before the coming of magic to Earl. And some of them hurried off to the house of the friar, and took refuge with him amongst his holy things, from all the unhallowed shapes that there were in their streets, and all the magic that tingled and loomed in the air. And he guarded them with his curses, which floated away the light and almost aimless will-o'-the-wisps, and even at a short distance awed the trolls, but they ran and capered only a little way off. And while the little group clustered about the friar, seeking solace from him against whatever impended, with which the air was growing tenser and grimmer as the short day wore on, there went others to Gnarl and the busy elders of Earl to say, "See what your plans have done. See what you have brought on the village." And none of the elders made immediate answer, but said that they must take counsel one with another, for they trusted greatly in the words said in their parliament. And to this intent they gathered again at the forge of Gnarl. It was evening now, but the sun had not yet set, nor Gnarl gone from his work, but his fire was beginning to glow with a deeper color among the shadows that had entered his forge. And the elders came in there, walking slowly with grave faces, partly because of the mystery that they needed to cover their folly from the sight of the villagers, partly because magic hung now so gross in the air that they feared the imminence of some portentous thing. They sat in their parliament in that inner room, while the sun went low and the elfin horns, had they but known it, blew clear and triumphantly, and there they sat in silence, for what could they say? They had wished for magic, and now it had come. Trolls were in all the streets, goblins had entered houses, and now the nights were mad with will-o'-the-wisps, and all the air was heavy with unknown magic. What could they say? And after a while Gnarl said they must make a new plan, for they had been plain bell-fearing folk, but now there were magical things all over Earl, and more came every night from Elfland to join them, and what would become of the old ways unless they made a plan? And Gnarl's words emboldened them all, though they felt the ominous menace of the horns that they could not hear. But the talk of a plan emboldened them, for they deemed that they could plan against magic, and one by one they rose to speak of a plan. But at sunset the talk died down, and their dread that something impending grew now to a certain knowledge. Oth and Threll knew it first, who had lived familiar with mystery in the woods. All knew that something was coming, no one knew what, and they all sat silent, wondering in the gloaming. Lureloo saw it first. He had dreamed all day of the weed-green tarns of Elfland, and growing weary of earth, had gone all lonely to the top of a tower that rose from the castle of Earl, and perched himself on a battlement and gazed wistfully homewards. And looking out over the fields we know, he saw the shining line coming down on Earl, and from it he heard rise faint, as it rippled over the furrows, a murmur of many old songs, for it came with all manner of memories, old music and lost voices, sweeping back again to our old fields what time had driven from earth. It was coming towards him bright as the evening star, and flashing with sudden colors, some common on earth, and some unknown to our rainbow, so that Lureloo knew it at once for the frontier of Elfland. And all his impudence returned to him at sight of his fabulous home, and he uttered shrill gusts of laughter from his high perch that rang over the rooftops below like the chatter of building birds. And the little homesick trolls in the lofts were cheered by the sound of his merriment, though they knew not from what it came. And now Orion heard the horns blowing so loud and near, and there was such triumph in their blowing, and pomp, and withal so wistful a crooning, that he knew now why they blew, knew that they proclaimed the approach of the princess of the elfin line, knew that his mother came back to him. High on her hill Zerundarel knew this, being forewarned by magic, and looking downward at evening she saw that star-like line of blended twilights of old lost summer evenings sweeping over the fields towards Earl. Almost she wondered as she saw this glittering thing flowing over the earthly pastures, although her wisdom had told her that it must come. And on the one side she saw the fields we know, full of accustomed things, and on the other side, looking down from her height, she saw behind the myriad-tinted border the deep green elfin foliage, and Elfland's magical flowers, and things that delirium sees not, nor inspiration on earth, and the fabulous creatures of Elfland prancing forward, and stepping across our fields, and bringing Elfland with her, the twilight flowing from both her hands, which she stretched out a little from her, was her own lady, the Princess Lyrizel, coming back to her home. And at this sight, and at all the strangeness coming across the fields, or because of old memories that came with the twilight, or bygone songs that sang in it, a strange joy came shivering upon Zerundarel, and if witches weep, she wept. And now from upper windows of the houses the folk began to see that glittering line, which was no earthly twilight. They saw it flash at them with its starry gleam, and then flow on towards them. Slowly it came, as though it rippled with difficulty over earth's rugged bulk. Though moving lately over the rightful lands of the Elf King, it had outspeeded the comet. And hardly had they wondered at its strangeness when they found themselves amongst most familiar things. For the old memories that floated before it, as the wind before the thunder, beat in a sudden gust on their hearts and their houses, and lo, they were living once more amongst things long past and lost. And as the line of no earthly light came nearer, there rustled before it a sound as of rain on leaves, old sighs breathed over again, old lovers' whispers repeated. And there fell on these folk, as they all leaned hushed from their windows, a mood that looked gently, wistfully backward through time, such a mood as might lurk by huge dock-leaves in ancient gardens, when everyone is gone that has tended their roses or ever loved the bowers. Not yet had that line of starlight and bygone loves lapped at the walls of Earl or foamed on the houses, yet it was so near now that already there slipped away the daily cares that held folk down to the present, and they felt the balm of past days and blessings from hands long withered. Now elders ran out to children that skipped with a rope in the street to bring them into the houses, not telling them why, for fear of frightening their daughters. And the alarm in their mothers' faces for a moment startled the children. Then some of them looked to the eastward and saw that shining line. "It is Elfland coming," they said, and went on with their skipping. And the hounds knew, though what they knew I cannot say, but some influence reached them from Elfland, such as comes from the full moon, and they bayed as they bay on clear nights when the fields are flooded with moonlight. And the dogs in the streets that always watched lest anything strange should come, knew how great a strangeness was near them now, and proclaimed it to all the valley. Already the old leather worker in his cottage across the fields looked out of his window to see if his well were frozen, saw a May morning of 50 years ago, and his wife gathering lilac, for Elfland had beaten time away from his garden. And now the jackdaws had left the towers of Earl and flew away westward, and the baying of the hounds filled all the air, and the barking of lesser dogs. This suddenly ceased, and a great hush fell on the village, as though snow had suddenly fallen inches deep. And through the hush came softly a strange old music, and no one spoke at all. Then where Zerundarel sat by her door, with her chin on her hand, gazing, she saw the bright line touch the houses and stop, flowing past them on either side, but held by the houses, as though it had met with something too strong for its magic. But for only a moment the houses held back that wonderful tide, for it broke over them with a burst of unearthly foam, like a meteor of unknown metal burning in heaven, and passed on, and the houses stood all quaint and queer and enchanted, like homes remembered out of a long past age by the sudden waking of an inherited memory. And then she saw the boy she had nursed step forward into the twilight, drawn by a power no less than that which was moving Elfland. She saw him and his mother meet again in all that light that was flooding the valley with splendor. And Alveric was with her, he and she together, a little apart from attendant fabulous things that escorted her all the way from the vales of the Elfin mountains. And from Alveric had fallen away that heavy burden of years, and all the sorrow of wandering. He too was back again in the days that were, with old songs and lost voices. And Zerundarel could not see the princess's tears when she met Orion again, after all that separation of space and time. For though they flashed like stars, she stood in the border in all that radiance of starlight that shone about her like the broad face of a planet. But though the witch saw not this, there came to her old ears clearly the sounds of songs returning again to our fields, out of the glens of Elfland, wherein they had lain so long, which were all the old songs lost from the nurseries of earth. They crooned now about the meeting of Lirazel and Orion. And Niv and Zend had ease at last from their fierce fancies, for their wild thoughts sank to rest in the calm of Elfland, and slept as hawks sleep in their trees when evening has lulled the world. Zorundarel saw them standing together where the edge of the downs had been, a little way off from Alveric, and there was Vand amongst his golden sheep that were munching the strange sweet juices of wonderful flowers. With all these wonders Lirazel came for her son, and brought Elfland with her, that never had moved before the width of a harebell over the earthly border. And where they met was an old garden of roses under the towers of Earl, where once she had walked, and none had cared for it since. Great weeds were now in its walks, and even they were withered with the rigor of late November. Their dry stalks hissed about his feet as Orion walked through them, and they swung back brown behind him over untended paths. But before him bloomed in all their glory and beauty the great voluptuous roses, gorgeous with summer. Between November that she was driving before her and that old season of roses that she brought back to her garden, Lirazel and Orion met. For a moment the withered garden lay brown behind him, then it all flashed into bloom, and the wild glad song of birds from 100 arbors welcomed back the old roses, and Orion was back again in the beauty and brightness of days whose dim fair shades his memory cherished, such as are the chief of all the treasures of man. But the treasury in which they lie is locked, and we have not the key. Then Elfland poured over Earl. Only the holy place of the friar and the garden that was about it remained still of our earth, a little island all surrounded by wonder, like a mountain peak, all rocky, alone in air, when a mist wells up in the gloaming from highland valleys and leaves only one pinnacle darkly to gaze at the stars. For the sound of his bell beat back the Rune and the twilight for a little distance all round. There he lived, happily contented, not quite alone amongst his holy things, for a few that had been cut off by that magical tide lived on the holy island and served him there. And he lived beyond the age of ordinary men, but not to the years of magic. None ever crossed the boundary but one, the witch Zorundarel, who from her hill that was just on the earthward border would go by Broom on starry nights to see her lady again, where she dwelt unvexed by years with Alveric and Orion. Thence she comes sometimes, high in the night on her broom, unseen by any down on the earthly fields, unless you chance to notice star after star blink out for an instant as she passes by them, and sits beside cottage doors and tells queer tales to such as care to have news of the wonders of Elfland. May I hear her again. And with the last of his world-disturbing runes sent forth, and his daughter happy once more, the elfin king on his tremendous throne breathed and drew in the calm in which Elfland basks, and all his realms dreamed on in that ageless repose of which deep green pools in summer can barely guess. And Earl dreamed too with all the rest of Elfland, and so passed out of all remembrance of men. For the 12 that were of the Parliament of Earl looked through the window of that inner room, wherein they planned their plans by the forge of Gnarl, and gazing over their familiar lands, perceived that they were no longer the fields we know. End of The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. This has been recorded for you by Michelle Fry. It was a privilege to read it, and I thank you for listening.
Your saga may vary, and again, thank you for coming along with me on the journey into Elfland.